Awesome. And then, cool. So again, welcome to Empowering Youth. We are this week. Oh, here comes Rebecca. This week we are going to talk about learning theory. And the question is your learning theory up to date? And I'm excited about this one. But as we start off, I want to say, let's take a collective breath and make a promise for openness and curiosity. So let's all breathe together, a deep breath in. And now. And I want to ground this space for community. Again, I just want to remind that no one's an expert here. Everybody has something to contribute, and sometimes those contributions are thoughts to add, and then sometimes those are questions as well. We want to respect everybody's journey where they are in parenting and in learning. We want to practice grace, make sure that this is a discrimination-free space, and just kind of embrace the spectrum of self-directed learning and parenting. All right. And yeah, for any for guests or viewers at this point, feel free to share any challenges or questions that are coming up either now or during the talk, because those will likely be things that we talk about in the future. So with this call, is your learning theory up to date? Why is this important? It sounds really academic and it sounds really stuffy, but how we understand learning is how we educate our children, right? So using the mindset that we have and the parameters that we're understanding learning is how we educate our children. So likely all of us were molded by school in our formative years. So it's best to know what's at play at school, especially when we're trying to envision something for our children, possibly something else, okay? And school was never, I guess this is a good start. School was never evidence-based. A teacher at the front of the class of students sitting at desks, that was just cost-effective and convenient. And that is kind of the beginning of public school. And a lot of us, when we have grown up in public school and we were raised a lot by our teachers, then what tends to happen is we integrate that into our thought processes. And it's not something that we're ever questioning unless you're really taking the time to question. And there's a term, deschooling, where you really just start to think about like, well, is this the best way? Does this serve me? Should I be doing this with my child because my teacher did it with me or my parent did it with me? So today what we'll be talking about are, hopefully, we'll get to 3 learning theories: behaviorism, which was the earliest; cognitivism, which came about the 1960s, and then constructivism, which was kind of there for a while. There's no set like start date that it came about, but that's kind of the most current one in terms of currently accepted. So behaviorism. What is behaviorism? Behaviorism came from like Pavlov's dogs. I'm sure a lot of people understand that. Around 1897, and basically it was this idea that you can change animal behavior and reactions through training. That's largely what we were doing. We were training animals. And we were like, a lot of scientists and a lot of the community were like, well, we can train people too, right? And then so this comes about in a very specific way, well, in a lot of ways, but in 2 ways would be rewards and punishments. So I want you to think about rewards and punishments, and how have they played a role in your life and possibly your parenting. So think about that for a bit, and let me know if you have a thought. Yeah, Belen.
I think most parents think that on rewards and punishment, it works in the short term because the child stops doing whatever you don't want him or her to do, or does whatever he or she, I mean, you want them to do. But in the long run, it doesn't help. And I think the punishments are kind of, you're making the person feel bad and then you expect them to do better. So I'm not sure how it works on a child's mind, the punishment, and yet we parents sometimes think that that's the way to make them better or feel better about themselves or be more independent or be, how does a negative turn into a positive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't want to right off the bat answer that, but what I want to say is that does that necessarily mean that no punishments work? Does that necessarily mean that no rewards work? Again, just something to keep in our mind. Jeff, any thoughts?
Yeah, I can probably just add to what Belen said. It's a good point. I think rewards and punishment as like motivation for behavior is just, and it's very short-term thinking just generally. If you're, I don't think people that parents, especially parents from my experience, that engage in that type of just like positive, like either reward behavior or give consequences for negative behavior. I don't even think they would actually think long term in terms of what's actually going to be best for my kids. I think that the whole concept of reward and punishment is short term. I think the real thing is to kind of anytime like I'm trying to convince or persuade, you need to kind of present the case, present evidence, right? Try and use any forms of means of developing rationality in your child, to have them think of their own consequences, cause and effect, right? I'm always kind of thinking of these just like philosophical implications for whatever I'm doing as a parent. It's not just what's happening right now, it's what am I teaching my daughter about the world, about learning, or anything. So the short term is always kind of in my mind, but it's always with the context of what are you teaching them philosophically about like life, about like their spirit. And so like you can do short term, you can do like positive and negative reinforcement, but I think that in itself is, if you haven't kind of integrated that into like a long-term philosophical framework of how to be a parent, that's already I think it's already a disadvantage.
That's awesome. I love that. This brings up so much for me. Short term versus long term. And I think for a lot of parents, short term is kind of that autopilot for them. It's what they learned and it's what they're going to do. And it's served them as kids. And so it'll serve them as adults as well. And when you talk about long term, immediately you're entering this different realm of intentionality that a lot of parents don't get into, right? There might be thoughts about it, but the easiest way is to think short term, and that means reactions. But then when you enter long term, there is, again, like I said, this intentionality where you are considering, you're reflecting on what's working, what isn't working. And for me, when you enter that long term, a lot of the times that brings up things like, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that. And then, you know what, I need to apologize to my child for doing that and explain what I want to be doing. Actually, like, these are my values and what I didn't match that. Super important. Thanks, Jeff. That's really helpful. Another thing that you brought up is that we want to put this a little bit more in the child sphere. It shouldn't be coming from us as parents in terms of what's right or wrong, and then leading them to do that right behavior. Sure, we're parents, so we're not going to take ourselves completely out of the equation. We have discussions. We want to talk things through and hear their thoughts and their perspectives. And there are places where we're going to put our foot down, kind of for the betterment of the family and sometimes for the betterment of the child. But rewards and punishments lead a child away from themselves. It disconnects themselves. It disconnects themselves from themselves, as complicated as that sounds. Basically, when you're when you're doing something, when you get rewarded or punished for doing something, then you go to that reward and punishment, and that is your focus instead of anything inside yourself. So it's not intrinsic anymore. It's not intrinsic motivation to be a good person. It's not intrinsic motivation to do the best that you can in something you really love. It's extrinsic. And what that means is that the child is forgetting about the important things that they need to know inside themselves, their feelings, their thoughts, their reflections. And it's like, let me avoid getting punished, or let me make sure I get that star. When some of the examples of rewards and punishments would be things like star charts, praise even, which is something that's really slippery because praise comes out in a lot of ways, prizes. And then if we're talking about school, things like grades, detentions, especially. We talked a bit about this. What do you think might be the downsides, if you can add anything to this conversation, what might be the downsides of using these types of rewards and punishments? And feel free to think about praise too, because praise is something as simple as saying good job. Is that helpful? Is that harmful? Is that kind of in the gray area in the middle? And how do we go about being intentional in that area?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. I think, even like praise is, I mean, positive or negative, right? It's still not helping, and generally speaking, it's just not helping a child develop their sense of identity, right? And their sense of kind of belief that they can handle the complexities of the world, right? You're just kind of stringing them along in a certain way. I think, if anything, I'll use praise in my own experience with like a thought process that my daughter has, or something like when I see her engaging in a certain type of thinking, or that's when I will kind of deliver praise. It's much more, I think I try and be very selective about what I'm praising. What you made a great point is that positive praise can also be as damaging as it's like punishment, right? It's the same process where just the reward or punishment becomes like the reality, as opposed to the growth, as opposed to just the ability to develop independence and kind of like the positive thought process, which is what you really want to try. I'm trying at least try to develop with my daughter. So anytime she shows like evidence that she's really trying to think through things and she can present a case for something, even if we have a disagreement, I'll always say, give me your best argument. Can try and convince me otherwise, just the things where you can challenge them to, they can do something, maybe they do something you disagree with, and they do, of course, they're kids, they're gonna do a lot of things that you disagree with. But how do they present the case for that? Are they going to do it in an emotional way through a tantrum, or are they going to kind of rationally think through? No, they might be wrong. They might be a different thought process than you'd expect. But the ability that you're trying to cultivate is just thinking, right? Just always trying to think through what they're doing. And I do think positive reinforcement can also derail that too if it's not done the right way. So definitely what you're talking about makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And adding on to what you're saying, Jeff, what I try to do is praise the effort. Like, I see you put a lot of effort in it instead of the good job or looking to please us parents. Because I think that here's where the intentionality, I think it's not there. If we do just rewards and punishment, and then we ask them, okay, now be independent, do your own thing. It's like they're at a loss because they never practiced this. So we're actually getting the outcome we didn't want.
Yeah, you both bring up really good points. Jeff, you were saying, you're talking about being on the same level. We're talking about empowering youth is what we are. Being on the same level with your child and saying, state your case. Tell me what your thoughts are, right? Because I'm going to do the same thing to you. I'm going to explain to you why I think that this should be this way. And we might not see eye to eye, but what's important is that communication, right? That dialogue that we're having. And because of that dialogue, that connection that we're having too. Because even if at the end of the day we disagree, we still heard each other out and know in the back of our minds what each other's thinking. And that's more important than agreeing with each other. And I think we could say this about adults as well, right? And then Jeff, you were hitting on something really interesting that rewards and punishments, I mean, the science is out, like it kills motivation. And aside from addictive random payout rewards, which we're talking about, like lottery type things, aside from them, it kills motivation, right? Because the experiments show that once you are done punishing or rewarding for that behavior, then that behavior, like the behavior of the child will like kind of return to what it was before. So if you are rewarding a child for even doing something that they love doing, they love riding their bike, and every time they ride their bike, you give them $1. Hey, good job riding your bike. Here's $1. If you stop giving that $1, then riding their bike, which was already intrinsically motivated and already fun, becomes something that's kind of not fun and empty anymore, because the child, in my understanding, feels kind of used at that point. They're like, well, it's I'm not really getting what I wanted out of it, and now I don't see it in the same light anymore, right? And that works for punishments and rewards. And then, Belen, what you were saying about praising effort, that's spot on. I totally agree with this. And a really good example is like art. When you see your child doing art, a really easy thing to say would be good job. And maybe, Jeff, what we're talking about here is like that quick reaction, that quick like short-term thing. Like, I want to praise my child. I want my child to feel good. So, hey, good job on that painting you did. Amazing, right? But what is that? That's empty, because we're praising just for doing something, right? And it's not even specific. It's not, but if we're praising for effort, then what we're doing is we're saying, hey, I like that you tried so hard, right? I like specifically that you did this. And again, good job is like very not specific. And I would almost say, yes, so there's kind of like steps here. Saying good job is like the bottom of the pack, right? And then in there is being very specific about your praise. Hey, I see how much blue you were using there, and I know you got frustrated when the blue ran out, but it was really cool how you added purple in there, and I think it's really cool. And then the next step is not even praising at all, but just recognizing. I saw that you used a lot of blue, and then it seemed like you were getting frustrated. Tell me what you did with the purple there. And then it's completely inside the child now. Let's hear all about your world, because I'm only guessing right now. And it's not up to me to praise you for the really cool things you did. Don't get me wrong, I'm a person, right? So if my child does something awesome, I'm going to say, hey, that's really cool, and I like it because this, and they're going to see the smile on my face, right? But I'm not going to be doing that for everything, and I'm not going to be saying good job about that, and I'm going to try to be more noticing of what's going on, all right? Okay, so some of the other downsides when we do praise and rewards, and we use other things that are behaviorism, we're not addressing the whole learner. We're just addressing behavior, right? So I'm sure you can agree with this, Jeff. We want to be thinking what's inside the head, what's going on in there, what's connected in there, what are they building from, right? And when we're talking just about behavior, it cuts so much. It's like a lab rat, right? At that point. It's not concerned, like I said, with like what's going on, what are their thought process. It's not concerned with their thoughts or feelings, which are, in my opinion, are equally important here. And one of the worst outcomes is for the kids that don't ascribe to punishments and rewards, the kids that don't fall in line to meet the needs of somebody else. They're the rebels, right? They're the ones that, you know, I don't want to do it, or I'm going to yell louder, or I'm going to do it even worse now because you're punishing me, right? It's disastrous for that group. So even in the short term, it doesn't work for everybody, punishments and rewards. Now, the reason that I bring this up is because punishments and rewards are still used today widely, right? They're used widely in school, and they are used widely in parenting. They can include things like hitting, which I hate to mention it, but it's still happening today, grounding, timeouts, and then on a different level, conditional love, things like ignoring behaviors, and then like what we were talking about, very targeted praise. And again, there's like a spectrum there, right? But ignoring behaviors is saying that I will only give you my attention when you're doing what I want. So I'm only going to connect with you when you're meeting my needs, right? Or when you're doing what I want. And that's kind of unfair for a child who is a full human as well, right? And still learning emotional needs and things like that. Any thoughts on those?
Well, yeah, what you bring up is something that I'm always very cognizant of. Is just that with kids, you always want them to develop their own grasp of reality, their own sense of independent thinking. And if all of your interactions revolve around kind of dependent on your emotional state as a parent, or just like what you want them, or you're kind of just stringing them along into certain behaviors, they're never that's basically, I think, when they grow up, that's how they're going to perceive the world. And that's really depressing if you think about like that. You never have your own sense of worth as a producer, as an independent person, as just somebody that can take on, that can think independently, that can be a nonconformist in a sense, right? Because you're training them, I think, doing this way that we're talking about, you're training them to just be kind of dependent on somebody else, right? So now as a young kid, it'll be as a parent, but then maybe as an adult, they're going to be maybe dependent on kind of dysfunctional relationships, or they're going to always be kind of, it's more or less a victim mentality, expecting somebody to come and kind of dictate the terms to them. I think it starts, as youth, right? It starts as a young child. But you have to develop these habits, to develop these good thought process of really kind of engaging them to think for themselves and weigh the consequences of their actions, as opposed to just kind of this passive kind of dependence on whatever as a parent, whatever you think is important, in that given moment for the child to do.
Yeah, and even for the children that are super smart, super intelligent emotionally, it's not necessarily that they'll never grasp what they need, right? It's not that they'll never understand, like, to listen to their own bodies and to listen to their own thoughts and please themselves instead of pleasing others. It's just that process will start much, much later, if at all, right? And that's scary, right? Belen.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on that if the relationship with the children with us parents is reward or punishment, then they don't have a safe place to go when they make a mistake. So it's about relationship. It's about building the relationship also. Not only will they be at a loss, but we are not that place where we want to be, which is, if you have a problem, come to me. You're not in trouble. So that dichotomy between punishment and rewards kind of alienates this. I mean, it makes them dependent on whether we approve or not, but it also, they're at a loss because they don't have a safe place to go. We're not that parent.
Yeah. So in what you're doing by punishing or rewarding is you are pushing them away in a way, right? And that's the last thing that you want as a parent, because you should be shooting for that connection. You should be shooting to relate to your children and to understand them, and for them to understand you, and to have fun together, to be curious together, to be open together. And when you have a reward or a punishment in there, it's doing the opposite.
And I think that's where it comes in. Dan, you mentioned it. It's thoughts and feelings and validation. We should be able to validate their thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's behaviorism, right? That's behaviorism in a nutshell. The next one is cognitivism, and then the last one is constructivism. I'm thinking I'm going to get half the way through cognitivism at this point. Cognitivism came about in the 1960s, and instead of just being reliant on the behavior to studying the behaviors and training behaviors, the scientists started getting a little bit smarter and saying, hey, you know what, there's actually thinking going on here. And thinking was tricky, though, because how do you study thinking? How do you do a scientific study of thinking? And the easiest way to do that is to kind of sanitize the environment, make it disconnected from its context, and say, hey, you know what, I want you to remember these 10 words. And then in a minute, I want you to spit them back out to me, right? And that is how in the 1960s, scientists started testing this idea that people learned, children learned, right? And the testing is super important because that makes this objectively possible, right? I'm sorry, possible in an objective sense. But the problem is that's oversimplified. And if we're thinking about this, some of the examples, well, the category that this applies to largely for school, conventional school, and for kind of parents that are doing things like curriculum or school at home are test and drill, testing and drilling. So I want you to think about what that looks like, testing and drilling, whether in your childhood or things that you are currently doing or moved away from with your children. Yeah, think of a couple examples, some specific examples of testing and drilling. Any thoughts?
In my experience, and when I was in high school, the testing and drilling ended up, I realized that I had no general knowledge. You couldn't have a conversation on any particular subject when you're reaching that age that you start gathering with the adults in the family or trying to have conversations with adults. Like, you don't have any general knowledge. We did have one teacher that asked us to read the newspaper. And we were like, why would you want us to read the newspaper? We were so used to drilling and testing, and nothing was outside that world. So I think that's one of the downsides of it.
Yeah, I'll just piggybacking off what Belen just said. I would add that kind of that testing, that ruthless kind of systematic testing is there's nothing more than what we were just discussing in terms of behaviorism. You're just trying to, the testing becomes the reality, right? I think what Belen was saying is just, there's nothing beyond the test. You just basically reframe your whole mind, right? The whole framework. And I'm sure we all experienced this in public schooling when we were younger, and that's why we don't want our kids to be exposed to the same thing. But that there is no learning. That's exactly what Belen's exactly right. It's just your whole framework is just the test. You look at patterns, you basically understand. You learn tricks in terms of the scantrons, right? It's you learn the way though. You'll talk to other students. They're like, well, if the longest, I remember this one. The longest in the multiple choice, the longest answer is usually the right one. All these tricks to game the system, but it's not learning. It's nothing valuable in a meaningful sense. It's to me, it's no different than when you're little, like you were saying, riding the bike, you get $1. It's just another instance of that. It's more complex. It's probably more abstract, but essentially I can boil it down to the same thing.
That's so interesting. I love that you shared that, Jeff. And Belen, what you're talking about with basically pieces of knowledge that were tested on, that were taught and tested on, they're highly specific. They're abstract more often than not, especially when we're talking about math and like higher learning math. And it's just like abstract because we think that builds, smarter thinkers. So we're like, here, let's hit them with a lot of this abstraction without trying to build from somewhere. And that's why you have a bunch of kids that like, I don't know what trigonometry was or calculus, but I took them all in high school, and I couldn't tell you the first thing about what they are. I can't even tell you what I memorized for the test, and I don't know how they're applied anywhere. And that's true for a lot of the people that take those courses. And then the fact that it's siloed, that it's out of context, like what you were saying, Belen, you were like, you don't have things that you can communicate to other people. You can't communicate test pieces, right? And what it does is it leads kids into exactly what you were saying, Jeff, like trying to learn the test, you know, and kids do that not only with tests, but they do that with teacher behaviors. This is one thing that I really learned going through my teaching certification, that kids will study the teacher, and they'll teachers will, and adults and humans will often say, do you think it's this one or this one? You know, and it's always the second one. And it's not hard for kids to be like, oh, it's the second one. I've seen this 3 times in a row. And she puts that emphasis on her voice when she's talking about this choice. And then the teacher's like, okay, that was my formative assessment. I figured out in the middle of my teaching that these kids know exactly what's going on. They're paying attention. And really, the kids just like hack the system, you know, and nothing's getting communicated.
Learning, it's not like that process is going to engage like the child or the student to like really like get a passion for learning anything else. It's just, I call it survive and advance, right? Just go to the next one, you know. It's just this kind of monotonous, I think it kind of, it's a little bit depressing, you know, when you just think about how much time we spent as kids, you know, as students in our own youth, kind of learning these things, because we did. I mean, we all did them. There were just shortcuts, and it was just so. And you said it. You know, you're done with the course. I took all these courses, especially even through calculus. What did you learn? I couldn't tell you. I had no idea. Yeah. What's the importance of this? I have no idea. Nobody knew anything. It's just, well, I got an A-. Great. All right, cool. That's great. And now what? Well, I'll go to the next class.
What's crazy though is a lot of the time adults will go through that. They'll suffer through school, the pieces that were terrible, and some even come out with wounds from school. And then when they're adults, they're like, oh, okay, well, that has to happen to kids still.
You write a passage or something.
Yeah, something, right? Like, well, you know, it didn't mess me up too bad. I'm okay. So
yeah.
let's keep
we're
going.
okay. Look at us. You know, we're fully functioning people, so we're good. It's just, you know,
yeah.
Pass it down.
You know, another thing too is that we get to this point where like we think enough people are behind school and conventional schooling, so this must be on purpose. There must be intentionality. There must be science, like lots of direct science behind this, which there is. But then we don't even listen to ourselves. And as we're taught to listen to other people and please other people. So then we're like, you know what, someone else has a handle on that. And even when it's my child, I don't feel great about it, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time reflecting and trying to change or making this work. That hurts. That hurts to hear and to experience and to listen to other people's stories about that. So that's cognitivism in a nutshell. We touched a little bit upon the downsides, but I want to get into that next time. And then talk about constructivism, which for me, for a lot of people, is like the answer. This is really how learning happens. And of course, that's not like the end all be all. There is other factions, other tangents from constructivism and other learning theories and learning processes that come from that. But I guess at this point, I want to say, again, I want to remind you, for any of the guests or anybody viewing this, share your challenges, thoughts, any questions that you have here, things that you're looking to have talked about in the future, and join or watch our next call. So I am going to